So go ahead and jump to your module directory and go ahead and open up the 10th step, which is called Drupal add.js. This is going to be applied to the interact.module file. So go ahead and make sure that your .module file is open here. And go ahead and copy the entire code that's in your Drupal add.js step and paste it in your interact.module file and save it. In this file, we've added two functions. One is interact menu, which is an implementation of hook menu. And this just includes our examples of adding JavaScript. And then we have our callback function, which is called interact examples. In our first line here, what we're doing is just getting the path to a script, interact.js, the same file that we've been working with up until this point. And we're going to use this script variable throughout several examples of the Drupal add.js function, which is the function that we use to add JavaScript to our page. The Drupal add.js function is pretty powerful. It allows us first to specify where we want our JavaScript added, and that can be in the header, in the footer, or even inline. We can set settings inside of a global JavaScript variable called Drupal that allows us to pass settings from PHP then to any JavaScript files that need to work with those settings. We can also do things like set the weight of JavaScript to make sure that it gets executed after additional JavaScript has been loaded. And so what we're going to do is go through most of the settings that you can use in Drupal add.js step by step and increase the complexity of our execution of Drupal add.js, starting with this simple example. In this example, what we're doing is passing a single variable to Drupal add.js, and that's the path to the script that's supposed to be added. By default, this file will get added to the header of the HTML file once it's rendered. And what I've done is added a return here, and what we're going to do is set a breakpoint so that we can watch what happens to this JS variable that is what's returned from Drupal add.js. This includes information about the current JavaScript files that have been loaded through Drupal add.js, and I just want to show you what that is. So we use breakpoints throughout these videos, and what it allows us to do is stop the execution of the script and see what's inside of variables in a very easy to use format. I'm going to go ahead and save the module file, and I'm going to jump to the browser. I'm going to make sure that we have a debug session starting, and I'm going to load the interact path right here. Okay, I'm going to jump back to the editor, and you can see by the yellow arrow that we've stopped the execution of the script right after this JS variable was set. Now we can take a look at what's inside this variable by going down to the Local Variables tab, and I'm going to expand this tree. You can see we have several settings here. We have the settings item, miss.drupal.js, miss.jquery.js, and notice that these are all files. Besides the settings, each one of these corresponds to a file that's going to be loaded when the page is ultimately rendered. So if we expand one of these, we'll see some information about it. Now we're going to go through several examples that show how to set these various settings for the file or the inline JavaScript that you're going to use. So we're not going to go over these in detail, but if you're curious about what sort of settings you can set for a JavaScript file, this is one way to take a look. You can just go ahead and take a look at what's returned from the Drupal add.js function. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end this debugging session. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the next example. I'm going to go ahead and remove this return here, and I'm going to comment this out and uncomment out the next example. Okay, in this one, we're doing the same thing that we did in the previous example, except we're being a little bit more explicit. As a second parameter, you can set a number of settings for the script that we're going to be adding. If you set it to a string, so that's what we're doing here instead of an array, which we're going to do in further examples, there are a couple of keywords you can use, one of which is file or inline. And the file will just specify that we're going to include this as a file. This is a file that we want to include. It's not straight up JavaScript. It's JavaScript that's wrapped up in a file. Okay, we can be even more explicit. I'm going to go down to this next example by passing an array as the second parameter to Drupal add.js and specify the type as file. So this example up here is just shorthand for this right here. Not every setting can be used this way as shorthand, but this is one of them. So we can go from here and talk about the different settings that we can use as this second parameter to Drupal add.js. I'm going to go ahead and jump to the next example and uncomment it out. Okay, in this one we're setting a setting called every page, and we're setting it to true. The every page setting comes into play when JavaScript aggregation is turned on. The goal of JavaScript aggregation is to condense several files, several JavaScript files into a single file, or at least a smaller number of files, so that the number of file requests per page load is reduced, and that should improve the performance of a page. What this every page setting does is say that it's okay to load this script on every page, and so we don't need to load it into a separate aggregated JavaScript file. This doesn't necessarily specify that this file will be loaded on every page. If aggregation is turned off, then this will only get loaded whenever we call Drupal add.js and load this script. So this only comes into play after the first time the script is loaded, and it gets added to that global aggregated JavaScript file. Okay, let's go ahead and jump to the next example. In this one, we're specifying a group parameter, and we're setting it to JS default. The group setting allows us to group JavaScript files according to weight. I'm also going to uncomment the next example because it also deals with weight. Now in this example, we're just setting group, and the group is the first level of weighting. If we want to further weight our file, we can use the weight setting as well and further order it, but within the grouping that we specify in group. The idea of weight is that sometimes we'll want to load certain JavaScript files before or after other JavaScript files. For example, we need the jQuery library loaded before we load most of the other files, so that will have a very low weight. Next will come JavaScript libraries or jQuery libraries, because those are dependent on jQuery, and then the other files that are dependent on those libraries. So in this, we're setting it to JS default, which is a constant that has a weight of 0. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and jump to the definition of this constant. In my editor, what I can do is hold down Control and click the constant, and it will jump to it. And here we have it right here. And you see that JS default is assigned a value of 0. So this is the weight of it. It's right in the middle, so it's neutral. However, there's two other definitions here. One is JS library, and this has a weight of -100. So this will get loaded before any of our JS default files. And this is where we would add JavaScript libraries or jQuery libraries or plugins. The other definition that we have is JS theme, and this gets loaded after all of the module files would typically get loaded. And so the theme layer is on top of the modules and can depend on the functions and code that's in those JavaScript files. So this has a weight of 100. Okay, I'm going to jump back to the file. Okay, so what this group will do is set the large weight, and then the weight will set a smaller weight to use within the group itself. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the next example of Drupal add.js. In this one, we're defining the scope. By default, the scope is set to header, which will load it in the header of the file before the content of the page has been loaded. However, sometimes we'll want to load the JavaScript in the footer of the file, so we can specify that here. The benefit to doing this is that sometimes we need the content of our page and all of the JavaScript files from the header already loaded, and all of those JavaScript files already having acted on the content that's in the body of the HTML file. And so this footer can happen at that level. We can also add something in the footer to improve performance. So if this is going to be a heavy action that our JavaScript file is going to take, we can put it in the footer and defer that action, and so it happens only after the page has been loaded and the user sees content on the page. However, because this happens after the content is loaded, sometimes the user will see a flash or a change in the content if the JavaScript has some effect on the content itself. So if that's the case, then we may want to put that JavaScript in the header and wrap it up in a behavior, which we'll talk about later on in this video.